it should work for you. And it was that kind of strain of thinking that I identified that really bothered me, was this tendency that human beings have to universalise their history, universalise the lessons of their experience, and say that what works in one context, that is my context, should work in everybody else's context. And if you've got a problem, then the way to solve that problem is for you to become more like me. Hence the title, People Like Us. So, People Like Us had a double meaning, or has a double meaning. One is this idea of egocentricity, the idea that the world would just be so much better as a place if everybody was like me. And that's really our solution. And if you excavate beneath the surface of most of the political analysis we see, that's what it comes down to. How would you solve the Middle East conflict? Well, if everybody there was more like me, it wouldn't be a problem. And so this is our prescription, that everybody becomes people like us. But then at the same time, there's a lack of understanding of people who are unlike us, because we tend to essentialise. The easiest way I can think to explain this, and this is kind of a cheap example, but I'm just going to use it because it's a quick, easy way of conveying the concept. When you have a serial killer emerge in Australia, particularly if they're white, what you don't see is a discussion of what's wrong with white Australian culture. What you do see is a lot of discourse about how did they grow up and were there any psychological issues and what was their possible motive, and that is, you humanise them, even though you're not, that's not your intention. You humanise them to try to get a richer understanding of what drove them. Sometimes you humanise them to an absurd extent, like you do with Carl Williams. But this is what we do. When, however, that assailant is from an outgroup, an ethnic outgroup, a religious outgroup, a national outgroup, someone that you don't immediately relate with, what you do is you explain their behaviour with reference to who they are. So, this person killed these people because they are just expressing their very flawed nature. And their behaviour comes down to what makes them different from me. That is, in the process, you forget all the human dimensions that influence human behaviour. Histories and frailties and all sorts of things. You tend to try to explain things with reference to some narrow prism of culture or whatever it is that you perceive as different. That is to say, you forget that you're talking about people like you. And so that's where People Like Us gets its term from. The book itself, I only figured out that really at the very end, once I'd written the book. So I wrote all these essays. It was just a bunch of rants really about things I didn't like, about the way the conversation was emerging. Both Western conversations about Islam and the Muslim world, but also Muslim conversations about the West, and how there was just so much nonsense in that. But once I'd written all these different aspects of it, and I go through the main, jihad and women and secularism and terrorism and the main sort of issues. Once I did that, it was only then the introduction was the last thing I wrote, and I thought, actually that's the thread that links these sorts of things. So you're right, I wrote it kind of out of frustration.
But the great point that you made though really was the one that you referred to at the end, and that is you can't judge a race by bad behaviour of individuals. And that's really a fundamental tenet of why you shouldn't have racial profiling, and that's really what was behind your book as well. I want to go on a bit further because, again, speaking from our reference point as a Western democracy, secularism is a separation of church and state is such a big thing, such an important tenet, such an important principle of how we operate in a democratic society. But you actually pull apart that whole notion of church and state, which I find quite interesting. And there is no notion of state in Islam. Or church. Yeah. So church or state actually don't correlate. And you might want to expand on that.
Okay.
As a sort of a...
Yeah, okay. So this is the way I tend to think. I take assumptions that are unquestioned and question them, and then get myself into trouble for doing it. Okay, in Australia, or in the West generally, we talk about secularism. And then when we look at other parts of the world that have different histories and different religious traditions and different cultural traditions, we tend to demand that they become secular. And I was writing this at the time when the Iraq War was a really big deal and the future of Iraq was heavily discussed. And one of the things people were very concerned about was that Iraq find a secular future. And there were 2 points I had to make about this. One was that the way we throw around the term secular demonstrates our lack of understanding of what it actually means and where the concept comes from. Secular really means or a secular system of government means that you have a separation between the church and the state. Now, at the risk of sounding like I'm patronising you, that presupposes that 2 things exist: the church and the state. You can't separate them if they don't exist. That separation is a unique fact of Western Christian history, not even Eastern Christian history. I mean, in Eastern Christendom, the 2 remain fused. In Greece, the Greek Orthodox Church retains a government role. Even in parts of Scandinavia, you have a fusion. But in the West, you had a separation between the church and the state. But what did that actually mean? Well, that emerged from a historical contest over authority in the world between kings and popes. It was popes saying, look, as God's representative, I should also have the power to rule dominions, and that means have control over the levers of state, armies, and so on. And the king saying, well, no, I divine temporal authority by divine right as well. And so there was this contest. That is, there was an institutional competition. Now, eventually, mainly because when you had a theocracy, when the church was in power, things were so disastrous. Over time, and through the process of the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment, we reached a point in Western history where we decided best that the church and the state are separated. What that doesn't mean is that it is best that religion plays no public role. What it does mean is that the church as an institution does not have control over the levers of power. And that's a lesson that made perfect sense in the context of Western history. Now, if you're talking to the Muslim world and you say separate church and state, you run into a problem in that there is no church.